She set a trap for a ghost, but caught her own fate. A story where hatred becomes brittle ice and darkness, the only place to be real. The silence of the Hogwarts library was usually Hermione Granger's oldest friend. It was a heavy, comforting blanket, woven from the scent of decaying parchment, the dust of centuries, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of 1,000 sleeping stories. But lately, the silence had changed. It had grown teeth. For the past week, the air between the stacks had felt charged, prickly with static electricity that had nothing to do with the dry winter air. It started as a subtle sensation, the fine hairs on the nape of her neck rising, a sudden coolness brushing against her cheek like a phantom breath. At first, Hermione had dismissed it as exhaustion. The 8th year was grueling, a relentless march of NEWT preparation, and the emotional labor of rebuilding a world that had been shattered only months prior. It was natural to feel on edge. But Hermione Granger did not rely on feelings. She relied on facts, and the facts were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. On Tuesday, her quill had moved 3 inches to the left, while she was looking up a reference on Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration. On Thursday, she had smelled it, a fleeting, impossible scent in the dusty air. It wasn't the usual smell of old leather or ink. It was crisp, sharp, and undeniably expensive. Ozone, expensive soap, and something akin to frozen green apples. It lingered for a second, then vanished, leaving her staring suspiciously at an empty chair. Now, it was Saturday night of the winter holidays. The castle was largely empty, most students having gone home to their families to celebrate the first peaceful Christmas in years. The corridors were silent, save for the howling wind battering the stone walls outside. Hermione sat in the oversized armchair of the head girl's private dorm, a heavy tome on advanced arithmancy resting on her knees. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. She turned a page. The parchment crinkled loudly in the quiet room. Then she felt it. It was a shift in the air pressure, a minute displacement of space near the window. The candles on the mantelpiece flickered, though there was no draught. Hermione didn't look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the complex equation for stabilizing time loops, but her grip on the book tightened until her knuckles turned white. Someone was in her room. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she forced her breathing to remain slow and even. This wasn't a Death Eater. The war was over. The wards of the castle were impenetrable. Besides, a threat wouldn't just stand there, radiating a strange, awkward hesitation. No, this was something else. This was the library ghost, the phantom of the stacks, finally bold enough to invade her sanctuary. A small smile, sharp and dangerous, tugged at the corner of her mouth. She had anticipated this. Analysis implies, she murmured aloud, pretending to read, that the variable creates an instability in the visual spectrum. She reached out, ostensibly to grab her cup of tea from the small table beside her. Instead, her fingers brushed a small, innocuous-looking rune she had carved into the wood earlier that afternoon. Click. The trap was sprung. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. A tripwire of magic, woven invisibly across the center of the room, snapped tight. From the ceiling, a bucket she had transfigured from a wastebasket tipped over. But it didn't rain water. It rained birds. Hundreds of small, bright yellow origami canaries, enchanted with a mild variation of the Opugno jinx, exploded into the air. They didn't attack. They swarmed. They filled the space with a deafening rustle of paper wings and high-pitched chirping squeaks. "What the?" The voice was distinctly male, distinctly shocked, and came from thin air right in the center of the room. There was a frantic scrambling sound, the squeak of boot soles losing traction on the stone floor, and then a heavy thud. The air shimmered like a heat mirage, rippling violently as the intruder flailed against the paper onslaught. A silvery fabric, fluid as water, slipped from the empty space, pooling onto the floor. And there he was. Draco Malfoy sat sprawled on her rug, legs tangled in the shimmering folds of Harry's invisibility cloak, all one very much like it. He was looking utterly bewildered. His platinum hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was disheveled, and he was currently engaged in a losing battle with 3 paper canaries that were affectionately trying to nest in his sweater. Hermione slowly closed her book. The heavy thump of the cover hitting the rest of the pages echoed in the sudden silence as the birds, sensing their job was done, fluttered up to perch innocently on the curtain rods and bookshelves. "Malfoy," she said. Her voice was calm, but inside, a mixture of adrenaline and utter incredulity was bubbling over. Draco froze. One hand was raised, halfway to swatting a canary away from his ear. He looked up at her, his pale grey eyes wide, blinking rapidly. His cheeks were dusted with a sudden, furious pink that clashed horribly with his attempt at a haughty expression. "Granger," he said. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, trying to lower it to a dignified drawl. "Fancy seeing you here." "In my room?" Hermione raised an eyebrow, leaning forward in her chair. "Yes, it is quite a coincidence, isn't it?" Draco scrambled to his feet, trying to kick the invisibility cloak away, as if it were incriminating evidence he had never seen before. He straightened his black jumper, brushed invisible dust from his trousers, and attempted to look like he hadn't just been defeated by origami. He paused, his eyes darting around the room, landing on the bookshelf, the fire, the window, and finally settling somewhere to the left of Hermione's ear. "I was testing the structural integrity of the castle wards for the headmistress." "In the head girl's bedroom?" "It's a structural weak point," Draco insisted, though the tips of his ears were burning a bright crimson. "Ancient masonry, Granger. Very temperamental. One moment it's solid, the next..." He gestured vaguely at the ceiling where the paper birds were watching him with beady ink eyes. "You're attacked by stationery." Hermione stood up, crossing her arms over her chest. She wasn't buying it, not for a second. But as she looked at him, really looked at him, the anger she expected to feel didn't quite materialize. He looked softer. Without the armor of his school robes, in a simple black wool jumper and dark trousers, he looked less like the Malfoy of old, and more like a boy who had grown into a man too quickly, and was now unsure what to do with the excess space. There was a tiredness around his eyes that mirrored her own, a shadow that the candlelight couldn't quite chase away. But right now, that shadow was being chased away by mortification. "You've been following me," she stated, stepping closer. The distance between them shrank, and the air crackled again, thicker this time. Draco scoffed, but it lacked his usual bite. "Don't flatter yourself. I have better things to do than trailing after swotty Gryffindors." "My quill moved on Tuesday." Hermione counted off on her fingers, stepping closer with each point. My books were rearranged on Thursday, and I smelled your cologne in the Transfiguration section. Draco flinched slightly. My cologne is subtle. It's impossible to detect. So, you admit it was you? He closed his mouth with an audible snap. He looked trapped, cornered not by magic, but by his own slip-up. He stared down at her, and Hermione realized with a jolt that he was taller than she remembered. Or maybe she had just never been close enough to notice without a wand drawn between them. I was bored, he muttered finally, looking away, his jaw working. Everyone's gone home. The castle is a tomb. And you? He hesitated, his gaze flickering back to her face, unguarded for a split second. You're the only thing in this place that makes any noise. The scratching of that infernal quill, the muttering, the aggressive page-turning. I do not turn pages aggressively. You treat books like they owe you money, Granger. A laugh bubbled up in Hermione's throat before she could stop it. It was a startled, genuine sound. Draco looked at her, surprised, and the tension in his shoulders dropped an inch. So, you decided to stalk me under an invisibility cloak because my study habits are loud. I wasn't stalking, he corrected, though the conviction was weak. I was observing, like a nature documentary. Here we see the bushy-haired bookworm in her natural habitat, threatening a helpless text on arithmancy. Hermione shook her head, an amused exasperation watching over her. You are ridiculous, Malfoy. I am a Malfoy, he corrected with a sniff, bending down to retrieve the silvery cloak from the floor. He bundled it up, clutching it to his chest like a shield. We are never ridiculous. We are merely eccentric. You were defeated by paper birds, she pointed out gently. Draco glared at the yellow canary perched on the lamp. He pulled his wand from his pocket and gave it a sharp flick. The bird burst into a shower of yellow confetti. A minor tactical error, he said. I wasn't expecting an ambush in a dormitory. It's unsporting. It's vigilant. It's paranoid. They stood there in the dim light, the silence returning, but the teeth were gone. It was a warmer silence now, filled with the scent of burning wood and, yes, green apples and ozone. Hermione felt a strange flutter in her stomach, not unlike the paper birds. Why was he really here? Boredom was a convenient excuse, but Draco Malfoy didn't do things just because he was bored. He did things with intent, and for the last week, his intent had been to be near her, unseen, unnoticed, just present. The thought made her heart skip a strange, uneven beat. She looked at his hands, clutching the cloak. They were long-fingered, elegant hands. She wondered, briefly and wildly, what it would have felt like if she hadn't set the trap. Would he have just stood there, watching her read? For how long? Well, Draco said, breaking the spell. He took a step back toward the door, his movements stiff. Since my cover is blown, and my dignity is currently scattered across your floor in the form of confetti, I suppose I'll leave you to your exciting equations. He reached for the door handle, but hesitated. He didn't look back, his profile sharp and illuminated by the dying firelight. Your trap was adequate, Granger, he murmured, the words barely audible. Creative. The replication charm on the parchment was a nice touch. Hermione blinked. A compliment from Draco Malfoy was rarer than a dragon in a bathtub. Thank you, she said, her voice softer than she intended. Next time, don't sneak up on me. I know some hexes that are far worse than paper cuts." He turned then, just slightly. A smirk played on his lips, not the cruel sneer of their childhood, but something crooked and almost boyish. "Noted," he said. "Good night, Granger." "Good night, Malfoy." He slipped out the door, closing it softly behind him. Hermione stood in the center of her room, surrounded by hundreds of yellow paper birds and the lingering scent of a winter storm. She looked at the spot where he had fallen. She should be angry. She should report him to McGonagall. She should upgrade her wards. Instead, she walked over to the armchair, picked up her book, and sat down. But she didn't read. She stared into the fire, a small, perplexed smile playing on her lips, touching the place on her neck where the phantom breath had been days ago. The castle felt quiet again, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt like the beginning of a game. And Hermione Granger had never lost a game in her life. The days following the incident with the paper birds were defined not by what happened, but by the excruciating weight of what didn't. Hermione Granger had expected retaliation. She had expected a counterstrike, a prank, or perhaps the cold, sneering indifference Draco Malfoy had perfected over 7 years of mutual loathing. She was prepared for war. She had defensive charms woven into her hair ribbons and a hex on the tip of her tongue every time she turned a corner. But the war didn't come. Instead, a heavy, suffocating stillness descended upon the castle, thicker than the snow piling up against the high Gothic windows. The library, once her sanctuary, had transformed into a landscape of anticipation. Every shadow stretching across the floorboards looked like a silhouette. Every creak of the settling stone sounded like a footstep. The feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by a maddening void. The phantom was no longer haunting her, and logically, she should have been relieved. She wasn't. Hermione sat at her usual table in the restricted section, the secluded alcove bathed in the golden, wavering light of floating candles. The castle was asleep. It was late, past curfew even for the head girl, but the dormitory felt too small, too filled with the memory of silver fabric pooling on the floor. Here, amidst the smell of rotting leather and dry ink, she could pretend to focus. She dipped her quill into the ink pot. The scratch of the nib on parchment was loud, aggressive. The emotional spectrum of non-verbal spellcasting requires a stabilized core of... She stopped. The ink blotted, spreading like a dark bruise across the page. Across the table, the empty chair creaked. It wasn't the wind. Hermione didn't look up immediately. She finished the sentence, her hand steady despite the sudden, violent kick of her pulse against her wrist. She felt the displacement of air, the arrival of a presence that was as familiar now as her own reflection. It brought with it the scent of cold air and that sharp, clean smell of ozone and apples. "You're not wearing the cloak," she said softly, her eyes still fixed on the text. "It seemed redundant," a voice replied. It was low, wrapped in velvet and rust. "You've already proven you have a knack for unveiling things." Hermione finally looked up. Draco Malfoy was sitting opposite her. He was leaning back in the chair, his posture deceptively relaxed, legs crossed at the ankle. He wore the same black wool sweater as before, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing pale forearms marked by the faint, silvery lines of old spell damage. and the dark, faded ink of the mark, half hidden by the shadow of the table. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the book in her hands, his expression bored, almost haughty. But his eyes, storm grey and rimmed with red, betrayed him. They were alert, hungry, scanning the title, her notes, the ink stain on her finger. "This is the restricted section, Malfoy," Hermione said, closing her book. The thud was softer this time. "You don't have a pass." "I'm an 8th year," he drawled, dragging his gaze up to meet hers. The impact was physical, a jolt of electricity that made her toes curl in her boots. "And the castle is empty. Rules feel somewhat flexible when there's no one left to enforce them." "I'm here." "Yes," he murmured, and the word hung in the air, vibrating with a double meaning she couldn't quite pass. "You are always here, Granger, the eternal constant." He reached out, his long, pale fingers drifting across the wooden table. He didn't touch her, but he traced the grain of the wood, moving closer to her hand until the heat of his skin radiated across the inch of space between them. "Why did you come back?" Hermione asked. Her voice was steady, but her breath hitched in her chest. This was the seesaw, the oscillation between the urge to hex him and the terrifying magnetic pull to lean forward. Draco paused. He looked at his hand, then at hers. "The dormitory is loud," he said quietly. "Loud? The silence there. It screams," he confessed, a flicker of raw honesty cracking through the veneer of his indifference. He looked away towards the darkness of the shelves. "Here, the silence is full. It has mass. It's easier to drown in." Hermione studied him. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way a muscle feathered near his temple. He looked exhausted, haunted not by ghosts, but by the living memory of his own choices. She knew that look. She saw it in the mirror every morning. The survivor's guilt, the feeling that they were merely wreckage left behind by the tidal wave. "You could read," she suggested, offering a truce. It was a dangerous olive branch. Draco let out a short, breathy laugh. "Read? I spent a year doing nothing but reading dark grimoires in a manner that smelled of snake venom and death. I've had my fill of words." "Then why come to a library?" "Because you're here." The admission was stark. It stripped the air from the room. Draco seemed to realize what he had said the moment the words left his lips. His eyes widened fractionally, and his walls slammed back up. He sneered, a reflex action. "Don't get any ideas, Granger. You're simply white noise. Your scratching quill drowns out the ringing in my ears. You are a functional object." "I am not an object, Malfoy," she snapped, the familiar irritation flaring hot and bright. It was grounding, this anger. It was safer than the pity or the curiosity. "And if I'm so annoying, you can leave." "Make me." The challenge was whispered. He leaned forward, encroaching on her space, his grey eyes darkening to the colour of a bruised sky. Hermione didn't retreat. She couldn't. Her pride, her Gryffindor's stubbornness, rooted her to the spot. She leaned in too, until they were breathing the same air, caught in a deadlock of mutual stubbornness. "I could deduct points," she whispered. "Pointless. I could hex you. Try it." They stared at each other, the tension ratcheting up, winding tighter and tighter until it felt like a violin string about to snap. Hermione could see the flecks of silver in his irises, the slight unevenness of his lower lip. She could smell the soap he used, clean and sharp, masking the scent of old magic that clung to him. She realized, with a sudden, terrified clarity, that he wasn't challenging her to a fight. He was challenging her to see him, to really see him, without the war, without the blood prejudice, without the history. He was daring her to look at the monster and not flinch, and he was terrified that she would. "You're shaking," Hermione noted softly. Draco flinched as if she had struck him. He pulled back abruptly, the connection breaking with a physical force that left Hermione dizzy. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the stone floor, shattering the intimacy of the moment. "It's cold in here," he muttered, turning his back to her. He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the immaculate strands. The heating charms are failing in this wing. Incompetent maintenance. Draco. The use of his given name froze him. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders stiffened under the black wool. Hermione stood up too. Her legs felt weak. "It's not the cold." He remained silent for a long beat, his silhouette framed against the towering shelves of books that held secrets darker than anything they were discussing. "You don't know anything about me, Granger," he said, his voice low and venomous, but lacking the conviction to make it hurt. "You think because you saved the world, you understand how it works? You think because you fixed your parents' memories, you can fix everything?" "I don't want to fix you," she said. The truth of it surprised her. I want to know why you're watching me. Really?" Draco turned slowly. His face was a mask of cold porcelain, but his eyes were blazing. "Because," he spat the word out, struggling with it. "Because when I look at you, I don't see the past. I see—" He stopped, frustration contorting his features. He took a step toward her, aggressive, desperate. "You are the most irritating, pedantic, insufferable person I have ever met. You are everything I was taught to hate. And you are the only thing in this godforsaken castle that feels real." He was close again. Too close. Hermione could feel the heat radiating off him. He looked at her like he wanted to devour her or destroy her, or perhaps beg her for forgiveness. The line between hatred and obsession was blurring, dissolving into something murky and terrifyingly hot. Hermione's heart hammered against her ribs. She should step back. She should leave. This was Draco Malfoy. This was the boy who had watched her be tortured in his own drawing room. But this was also the boy who had lowered his wand on the astronomy tower. The boy who was currently looking at her as if she were the only source of light in a collapsing universe. "Real is messy, Malfoy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," he breathed. His gaze dropped to her lips, hovered there for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, and then snapped back to her eyes. The conflict in him was palpable, the desire to reach out warring with the ingrained belief that he was poison. He clenched his fists at his sides, fighting a battle entirely within himself. "Good night, Granger," he said abruptly, his voice rough. He spun on his heel and stormed away, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the quiet library. He didn't look back. Hermione sank back into her chair, her knees giving way. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The library felt empty again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It wasn't waiting anymore. It was vibrating. She looked down at her parchment. The ink blot had dried into a shape that looked vaguely like a dragon, or perhaps a bird in flight. She touched her own hand, the spot where his finger had almost brushed hers. The skin tingled. She wasn't just curious anymore. She was captivated. And she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he would be back. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun, and the stakes were rising with every stolen glance, every broken silence. Hermione dipped her quill into the ink again. She didn't write about arithmancy. She wrote a single word on the corner of the parchment, then crossed it out violently until the paper tore. Draco. Insomnia was a tangible thing in the post-war castle. It was a heavy, grey fog that settled in the corridors after midnight, thick with the echoes of memories that refused to stay buried. For Hermione, sleep was a battlefield where she fought losing skirmishes against nightmares of burning forests and snake-faced monsters. For the third night in a row, she surrendered. She threw off her covers, the heavy velvet of the canopy feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a shroud. The common room was empty, the fire dead ash, but the silence there was too loud. She needed noise. She needed complexity. She needed something that required more brain power than the cyclic recounting of her own traumas. Her feet carried her down through the shifting staircases that groaned in their sleep, past the portraits pretending to slumber, down into the belly of the castle. The air grew colder, heavier, tasting of damp stone and the deep, earthy scent of the black lake pressing against the dungeon walls. The potion's classroom door was ajar. A sliver of sickly purple light spilled out onto the flagstones, cutting through the darkness like a bruise. Hermione stopped. Logic dictated she turn back. Curfew was in effect, and the dungeons was Slughorn's domain, or, historically, Snape's. But the scent drifting from the room hooked her. It was heavy, cloying, and sweet. Lavender, wormwood, and the metallic tang of soporiferous beans. Dreamless sleep. She pushed the door open. The classroom was shadowed, illuminated only by the fire under a single copper cauldron in the back corner, and the luminescent glow of the liquid bubbling within it. The shelves of pickled things in jars watched with dead, floating eyes. Draco Malfoy stood over the cauldron. He had shed the heavy wool sweater of the library. He wore a crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His skin, usually pale, was flushed with the heat of the fire, slick with a fine sheen of sweat. His hair was tied back in a careless short tail at the nape of his neck, exposing the sharp, vulnerable line of his jaw. He was chopping valerian roots with a rhythmic, violent precision. Chop, chop, chop. The silver knife flashed in the purple light. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't startle. It was as if he had attuned his senses to her frequency, expecting her arrival as inevitability. "You're cutting them too thick," Hermione said. Her voice was a whisper, absorbed instantly by the damp air. Draco's hand paused in mid-air. He looked at the root, then slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes were dark, pupils blown wide from the fumes or exhaustion. There were purple shadows beneath them that matched the light of the potion. "If I cut them thinner, the juice evaporates before it hits the base," he rasped. His voice was rough, unused. "I need the potency, Granger. Not the textbook aesthetics. If you need potency, you should be crushing them with the flat of the blade, not chopping," she countered, stepping fully into the room. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing them in. Crushing releases the bitterness. It destabilizes the stasis. Only if you don't counter it with a clockwise stir every 7th rotation. Draco stared at her. For a moment, the old sneer threatened to surface, the reflex to mock her know-it-all intrusion. but it crumbled before it could form, exhausted by the sheer weight of the night. He looked at the knife, then at the half-chopped pile of roots. He stepped back, a mere half-step, but it was an invitation, a surrender of territory. "Show me," he challenged softly. Hermione moved to the workbench. The space was tight. To reach the cutting board, she had to stand close to him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the peculiar, intoxicating mix of magical fumes and his own clean, sharp scent. She picked up the knife. The handle was warm from his grip. It felt intimate, like shaking hands with a ghost. She took a fresh root, laid the flat of the silver blade over it, and pressed down with the heel of her hand. Crunch. The root split, weeping a milky fluid. "Now," she murmured, scraping the crushed root into the cauldron. The liquid hissed, turning from violent violet to a soothing, deep indigo. "Stir, clockwise." Draco didn't argue. He reached for the glass rod. As he moved, his arm brushed against hers. It was a shock, a static discharge that zipped up her arm and settled heavy in her chest. Hermione drew a sharp breath. Draco froze for a fraction of a second, his muscles tensing under the white shirt, but he didn't pull away. He lowered the rod and began to stir. 1, 2, 3. They fell into a rhythm. It was a dance they both knew, a language they spoke better than English. In the silence of the dungeons, stripped of house points and war and expectations, they were just two alchemists seeking a cure. Hermione prepared the ingredients. Draco managed the brew. There was a terrifying compatibility to it. She knew what he needed before he asked. When he reached for the powdered moonstone, she was already uncorking the vial. When the potion began to simmer too aggressively, she lowered the flame with a flick of her wand before he could curse. The atmosphere grew thick, heavy with steam and unsaid words. The spiral of steam rising from the cauldron curled around them, knitting them together in a private world of indigo fog. "You're brewing a lethal dose," Hermione noted quietly, watching him add the third drop of hellebore syrup. "I have a high tolerance," Draco muttered. He was staring into the swirling liquid as if it were a scrying pool showing him a future he didn't want to see. "It's not for tolerance, it's for oblivion." Draco stopped stirring. He gripped the edge of the workbench, his knuckles white. The steam licked at his face, dampening the loose strands of hair. "And what would you know about it, Granger?" he whispered, not looking at her. What would the golden girl know about wanting to turn the lights off, about wanting the noise to stop? Hermione looked at his profile, the sharp nose, the pale lashes, the tremble in his hands that he was trying so hard to hide. She saw the cracks in the porcelain. "I'm here, aren't I?" she said simply. Draco turned his head. His eyes searched hers, stripping away layers of defense. He looked at her not as a mudblood, not as a rival, but as a fellow casualty. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in her bones. "You should be in your tower, dreaming of sugar quills and Order of Merlin medals." "I don't dream of those," she confessed. The vulnerability was terrifying, but the potion fumes made her brave. "I dream of Bellatrix. I dream of the floor of your manor." The words hung between them, suspended in the steam. Draco flinched. It was a visceral reaction, a physical recoil. He looked down at his left arm. The sleeve was rolled up, but the dark mark was on the inner forearm, turned away from her. He twisted his arm instinctively, hiding the faded ink against his side. "I can't scrub it off," he said, his voice hollow. "I've tried. Charms, potions, muggle chemicals. It's part of the skin. I didn't ask you to. You didn't have to. I see it in your eyes every time you look at me." "You see what you expect to see," Hermione said, stepping closer. The distance between them was negligible now. She could see the grey flecks in his irises. "I look at you, Draco, and I see someone who is trying to brew a potion to sleep without screaming, just like me." The use of his first name again acted like a physical blow. Draco's breath hitched. He looked at her mouth, then her eyes, a war raging behind his gaze. He looked hungry, starved for something he didn't know how to name, and terrified that if he tasted it, it would poison him. "The potion is done," he said abruptly. He killed the flame. The bubbling subsided instantly. The liquid in the cauldron was a perfect glossy black, smooth as a mirror. Draco picked up a crystal phial. His hands were shaking more noticeably now. He dipped it into the cauldron, filling it with a thick, dark liquid. He corked it, the sound loud in the quiet room. He held it out to her. Hermione blinked. That's yours. You spent 2 hours on it." "Take it," he commanded, his voice strained. He shoved the phial into her hand. His fingers were ice cold against her warm palm. "I can brew another, or I can just stay awake. I'm used to it." "Draco!" "Take it, Granger, before I change my mind and poison you with it." It was a deflection, a clumsy attempt to regain his villainous composure, but the jagged edge in his voice betrayed him. He wasn't giving her the potion to be noble. He was giving it to her because he couldn't bear the thought of her lying awake in the dark, haunted by the same ghosts that stalked him. It was an act of penance. Hermione's fingers closed around the warm glass. She didn't pull her hand away immediately. For a second, they were connected by the phial, a circuit closing. She looked down at his hand. There was a small white scar on his thumb from a chopping accident years ago. It was such a human detail. "Thank you," she whispered. Draco pulled his hand back as if burned. He turned away, beginning to vanish the remains of the ingredients with aggressive flicks of his wand. "Go," he said to the stone wall. "Get out of my dungeon." Hermione hesitated. She wanted to say something else, to bridge the gap that he was frantically trying to widen. But she knew the rhythm of this dance now. Push and pull, approach and repulsion. If she pushed too hard now, he would shatter. She clutched the phial to her chest. "Sleep well, Malfoy." "I won't," he replied. Hermione turned and walked out of the classroom. As she reached the door, she looked back. Draco was standing motionless in the dark, bathed in the fading purple light, his head bowed, his hands gripping the edge of the workbench until the knuckles were white. He looked like a king of a ruined kingdom, alone in the wreckage. She walked back up the stairs, the phial warm against her skin. When she reached her room, she didn't drink the potion immediately. She set it on her nightstand, watching the black liquid settle. It was a gift, a peace offering, a confession. She touched her arm where his had brushed hers. The skin still felt electric. Down in the dungeons, Draco Malfoy stared at the door where she had vanished. He lifted his hand, the one that had touched hers, and brought it close to his face. He inhaled sharply, seeking the scent she had left behind. Parchment, vanilla, and something fiercely alive. He sank to the floor, leaning his back against the cold stone of the cauldron, and closed his eyes. He didn't brew another potion. He didn't need to. For the first time in months, the chaos in his head had quieted, silenced not by magic, but by the terrifying realization that he was no longer alone in the dark. The hate was gone, and in its place, something far more dangerous was beginning to bloom. The morning after the dungeon, the air in the great hall was brittle. The ceiling reflected a slate-grey sky that threatened snow, a heavy, oppressive blanket over the castle. Hermione Granger sat at the Gryffindor table, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea, but the warmth didn't reach her fingertips. She had slept. For the first time in months, she had fallen into a deep, velvety oblivion, devoid of screams or green flashes, thanks to the phial of black liquid currently sitting empty on her nightstand. She should have felt restored. Instead, she felt unmoored. Across the hall, the Slytherin table was sparsely populated. Draco Malfoy sat at the far end, isolated in a pool of solitude. He looked impeccable, hair severe, robes pressed, posture rigid, a stark contrast to the unravelled, desperate boy in the white shirt who had chopped valerian roots with frantic violence. He didn't look at her, not once. When she caught his eye, or tried to, his gaze slid over her like she was made of glass, transparent, insignificant. The connection that had sparked in the purple light of the potion lab, the raw honesty of their shared trauma, had been sealed away behind a fortress of occlumency walls so high she couldn't see the top. The seesaw had tipped violently back to cold. "Don't," Ginny Weasley whispered, nudging Hermione's arm. She hadn't looked up from her porridge, but she saw everything. "He looks like he's ready to hex the first person who breathes too loud. Leave it." "I'm not doing anything," Hermione lied, buttering a piece of toast until it was a mangled mess. "You're staring, and he's ignoring you so hard it's actually vibrating." Hermione dropped her knife. The clang was lost in the morning chatter, but it echoed in her head. She didn't want to care. She wanted to be rational. But the memory of his cold fingers brushing hers, the look of terrifying vulnerability in his eyes, wouldn't fade. By afternoon, the weather had turned. A blizzard battered the castle, shaking the window panes. Herbology was the last place anyone wanted to be, but Professor Sprout had insisted that the 8th years needed to repot the mandrakes before the frost set into the greenhouse foundations. Greenhouse 3 was a tropical assault on the senses, while the world outside was frozen white/blue. Inside was a suffocating riot of green, smelling of wet earth, dragon dung fertilizer, and the cloying, heavy scent of flowering vines. The humidity hit Hermione like a physical wall the moment she stepped inside, instantly frizzing her hair and making her robes stick to her skin. "Partners," Sprout barked, clapping her soil-stained hands. "And no house clustering. Mix it up. We need inter-house unity if we're going to survive these screamers." Hermione didn't need to look. She felt him. He was a gravitational pull at the back of the room. "Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger," Sprout called out, pointing to a station in the far corner, obscured by the hanging tendrils of a particularly aggressive venomous tentacula. "You take the mature batch. They're temperamental today." Draco moved toward the station without a word. He passed her, and for a second the scent of green apples and ozone cut through the heavy stench of fertilizer. He didn't stop. He didn't acknowledge her. They stood side by side at the wooden potting bench. The tentacula writhed in the corner, its spiky vines undulating like snakes seeking prey. "Gloves," Draco said. It was the first word he had spoken to her all day. His voice was flat, devoid of the velvet rasp from the night before. "I know," Hermione snapped, pulling on her dragon-hide gloves with unnecessary force. They worked in a tense, rhythmic silence. Unpotting the mandrakes required coordination. One person had to hold the pot steady, while the other yanked the screaming root out and plunged it into fresh soil. The cries were muffled by the earmuffs, but the vibration travelled up their arms. Draco was efficient, brutal in his movements. He handled the roots with a detached competence. But Hermione noticed the tension in his jaw, the way a vein pulsed in his neck. The heat in the greenhouse was rising. Draco unbuttoned the collar of his shirt, sweat glistening at his temples. "You're ignoring me," Hermione said. She had taken off her earmuffs for a brief respite between pots. The sound of the storm outside battered the glass roof, sealing them in this humid green cage. Draco didn't remove his earmuffs. He kept working, staring intently at a pile of dirt. Hermione reached out and yanked the earmuffs off his head. He flinched, spinning to face her, his wand half drawn before he registered who it was. His eyes were wild for a split second before the mask slammed back down. "Do not," he hissed. "Touch me." "Why?" Hermione challenged, stepping into his space. The greenhouse was cramped. There was nowhere to retreat. "Because you're afraid you might accidentally be human again, like last night." "Last night was a lapse in judgment," he said coldly. "I was exhausted. I wasn't thinking." "You were thinking perfectly clearly. You helped me." "I wanted you out of my dungeon," he sneered, leaning down so his face was level with hers. "You were polluting my workspace. Don't mistake a moment of weakness for whatever this is." He gestured vaguely between them. "We are not friends, Granger. We are simply survivors stuck in the same building. Don't romanticize it." The cruelty in his voice was sharp, designed to cut, but Hermione saw the tremor in his hand where he gripped the bench. He was terrified. He was pushing her away because pulling her in felt like stepping off a cliff. "I'm not romanticizing anything," Hermione said, her voice shaking with anger. "I'm trying to understand why you're so determined to be miserable. You gave me that potion because you know. You know what it's like to stare at the ceiling and see ghosts. Stop talking. No, you don't get to open a door and then slam it in my face. I said stop." Draco slammed his hand down on the table. The sudden movement, the spike in emotional energy. It was enough. In the corner, the venomous tentacula, sensitive to noise and aggression, lashed out. A thick, spiny vine whipped through the air faster than thought. It wasn't aiming for the mandrakes. It was aiming for the source of the noise. "Look out!" Draco didn't think. He didn't calculate. He moved. He shoved Hermione hard, knocking her back against the glass wall of the greenhouse. The vine slashed through the space where her head had been a second before, cracking against the wooden bench with the sound of a whip. But the plant wasn't done. Another tendril shot out, wrapping around Draco's forearm, the left one. The thorns bit deep into the fabric of his shirt and the skin beneath. Draco let out a sharp, guttural cry of pain. "Diffindo!" Hermione screamed, her wand already in her hand. The severing charm sliced through the vine. The plant recoiled, hissing and thrashing, retreating into the shadows of the corner. Draco stumbled back, gripping his arm. Bright red blood blossomed on his white sleeve, mingling with the dirt. He was breathing hard, his face pale, eyes wide and shocked. Hermione scrambled toward him. "Draco! Let me see." "Get away!" he gasped, backing into the potting bench. He clutched his arm to his chest, shielding it, shielding the mark. "Don't be stupid. It's venomous." Hermione didn't ask for permission this time. She grabbed his wrist, his right wrist, and pinned him against the bench with her body, forcing him to stay put. She reached for his injured arm. "No! Granger, don't!" She ignored him, pushing his hand away and ripping the torn sleeve further to expose the wound. She froze. The thorns had raked across the dark mark. The faded black snake and skull were now bisected by 3 angry, bleeding gashes. The blood was running over the ink, making it look fresh, alive. It was a grotesque juxtaposition of old scars and new violence. But it wasn't the blood that made her breath hitch. It was the way Draco was looking at her. He wasn't fighting her anymore. He was frozen, pressed back against the table, his chest heaving against hers. He looked utterly defeated. He was waiting for her to recoil. He was waiting for her to look at the mark and see the monster. Hermione didn't recoil. She summoned a dittany from the shelf without looking away from his arm. "Hold still," she whispered. Her fingers were gentle as she applied the essence. Smoke rose from the wound, smelling of burning herbs. She traced the edge of the cut, her fingertips brushing the dark ink of the mark. Draco shuddered. It was a full-bodied tremor, a vibration that passed from him to her. "Why?" he breathed. The word was barely audible over the rain hammering the glass. "Why are you touching it?" Hermione looked up. Their faces were inches apart. The humidity had curled the loose strands of his hair. Beads of sweat clung to his upper lip. His grey eyes were wide, unguarded, stripping her bare. "Because it's just skin, Draco," she said softly. "It's just skin." Something in him broke. The tension that had been holding him upright snapped. He let out a shaky exhale, his head dropping forward until his forehead rested against hers. It was an intimacy more shocking than a kiss. It was a surrender. Hermione closed her eyes, overwhelmed by him. The smell of him, rain, blood, earth, and that clean soap filled her senses. She could feel his heart hammering against her chest, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her hands lingered on his forearm, holding him, anchoring him. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the sound of their breathing and the drum of the rain. There was no wall, no blood status, no past. Just the heat of the greenhouse and the desperate magnetic pull between 2 broken things trying to fit together. Draco's hand moved. His fingers grazed her waist, hesitating, trembling. He wanted to pull her closer. She could feel the intent radiating off him like heat. Then the bell rang. The shrill sound cut through the greenhouse, shattering the bubble. Draco jerked back as if he had been burned. He stumbled away from her, clutching his healed arm, his eyes wide with horror, not at the plant, but at himself, at what he had almost done, at what he had almost allowed. He looked at her one last time, his expression a chaotic mix of desire and self-loathing. "I can't," he choked out. He turned and fled. He didn't even grab his robe. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and disappeared into the blizzard, leaving Hermione standing alone in the stifling heat, her hands stained with his blood and the dirt of the earth, her heart pounding a rhythm that matched the storm outside. She touched her forehead where his had rested. It was still warm. The cold was back, but this time it burned. The castle had a way of metabolizing trauma, digesting the screams and the curses into the mortar of its stones, until only a heavy, resonant silence remained. For 3 days following the incident in the greenhouse, that silence was a physical weight pressing against Hermione Granger's chest. Draco Malfoy had vanished. He wasn't in the Great Hall for meals. He wasn't in the library, lurking in the shadows of the restricted section. The dungeon lab was locked, the doors sealed with wards so complex they made Hermione's teeth ache when she tried to probe them. He had become a ghost again, but this time he wasn't haunting her. He was erasing himself. Hermione moved through the corridors like a sleepwalker. The memory of the greenhouse, the wet heat, the smell of blood and ozone, the feeling of his forehead resting against hers, was a fever dream she couldn't shake. It was a terrifying, jagged piece of reality that didn't fit into the puzzle of her life. She had touched the dark mark. She had held the arm that had let Death Eaters into the school. And in that moment, she hadn't felt fear. She had felt a devastating magnetic pull towards the boy beneath the ink. She couldn't let it end like that, with him fleeing into the snow, convinced he was a monster. It was midnight on the 3rd day when the castle gave him up. Hermione was patrolling the 7th floor, ostensibly fulfilling her head girl duties, but in reality, she was hunting. The corridors were dark, the portraits snoozing in their frames. The only light came from the high arched windows, where the winter moon hung like a sickle, sharp and cold. Then she heard it. It was faint at first, a ripple in the air, a vibrations in the floorboards. Music, a piano. It wasn't a cheerful tune. It was a dark, cascading melody that sounded like water rushing over stones, like something breaking in slow motion. It was intricate, technical, and suffocatingly sad. Hermione followed the sound. It led her away from the common rooms, down a narrow, dust-choked corridor she hadn't walked since her 5th year, to the room of requirement. But the door wasn't there. Instead, the music was coming from a forgotten music room 2 doors down, the wood warped and the varnish peeling. She pushed the door open. The room was vast and bathed in moonlight. Dust motes danced in the silver beams like suspended stars. In the center, a grand piano of black lacquer sat like a sleek, dark beast. And there was Draco. He was playing with his eyes closed. His long, pale fingers flew across the keys with a violence that contradicted the beauty of the sound. He wasn't wearing his robes. He was in shirt sleeves again, the white fabric stark against the darkness, the top buttons undone. He looked thinner, sharper, as if the last 3 days had carved him down to the bone. Hermione stood in the doorway, afraid to breathe, afraid to shatter the spell. The music was a confession. It spoke of regret, of anger, of a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. It was the sound of the silence he had talked about in the library, finally given a voice. He hit a discordant chord, a jarring clash of notes that rang out like a scream, and stopped. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling. "You have heavy feet, Granger," he said. His voice was dead, flat. He didn't turn around. "I wasn't trying to sneak up on you," Hermione said, stepping into the room. The air here was cold, smelling of old resin and dust. "You're always sneaking," Draco murmured, dropping his hands to his lap. He stared at the keys as if they had betrayed him. "Creeping into my library, my dungeon, My head. You let me in. I made a mistake. He turned on the bench then, slowly. The moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face, illuminating the dark circles under his eyes. He looked wrecked, beautiful and wrecked. Go away, Hermione, he said. The use of her first name was a weapon, not a gift. It was said with a weary finality. No. Draco let out a dry, mirthless laugh. Gryffindor courage, or is it just a lack of self-preservation? Did you learn nothing in the greenhouse? I learned that you're not as heartless as you pretend to be, she said, walking closer. She stopped at the curve of the piano, running her hand along the cool black wood. I learned that you saved me. I saved myself, he snapped, standing up abruptly. The bench scraped loudly against the floor. The plant was reacting to the noise. If it had hit you, the investigation would have brought the ministry down on my head. I don't need auras sniffing around my past. Liar. The word hung in the air between them. Draco glared at her, his chest heaving. Believe what you want. Paint me as a hero if it helps you sleep. But don't come looking for me expecting a fairy tale redemption arc. I'm not Prince Charming Granger. I'm the villain. I'm the one who fixes the cabinet. Remember? I remember, she said, steady. I remember everything. I remember the slurs. I remember the bullying. I remember the manner. Draco flinched. He turned away, walking towards the window, putting distance between them. He gripped the sill, staring out at the frozen grounds. Then why are you here? He whispered, his voice cracking. Why aren't you running in the other direction? Hermione watched his back. The tension in his shoulders was painful to witness. Because the war is over, Draco, but you're still fighting it. He spun around, his expression twisted with fury. The war is never over. Not for me. It's in my skin. It's in my blood. You touched it! He gestured violently to his left arm. You saw it. It's ugly and it's permanent, and it rots everything it touches. It's a scar, Hermione said, her voice rising. It's ink. It doesn't dictate who you are. It tells the world exactly who I am. It says I chose the wrong side. It says I bowed to a monster. It says I am broken. We are all broken, Hermione shouted. The echo rang through the room. She took a breath, her hands shaking. I wiped my parents' memories, Draco. They don't know I exist. I look in the mirror and I see the girl who was tortured on your drawing room floor. I am broken too, but I am trying to heal. You're just trying to bleed out in silence. Draco stared at her. The fury drained out of him, leaving him hollow. He looked at her with a devastating mixture of awe and misery. You don't understand, he said softly. He walked back towards her, stopping just out of reach. I'm not trying to bleed out. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From me. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, but this time it wasn't aggressive. It was desperate. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, trembling before he let it drop. You are light, Granger, he murmured, his eyes searching hers. You are blazing, blinding light, and I am just the shadow that tries to swallow it. If you get too close, I will dim you. I will drag you down into the dark with me, and I couldn't bear that. The confessions stripped the air from Hermione's lungs. It wasn't hatred that kept him away. It was a twisted, self-sacrificing form of reverence. He worshipped her from the dark because he thought he was unworthy of standing in the sun. You get to decide that, Hermione whispered. You don't get to decide what I can handle. I'm not fragile, Draco. I'm not a porcelain doll you need to keep on a shelf. I know you're not fragile, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. You're terrifying. Then let me be terrifying. Let me choose. She took a step forward. The distance between them vanished. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the soap and the cold night air. She reached out and took his hand, the left one. Draco went rigid. He looked down at their joined hands, her small, ink-stained fingers wrapped around his pale, scarred ones. She turned his hand over, exposing the wrist, the forearm hidden beneath the white sleeve. She didn't roll up the sleeve. She just held his wrist, her thumb resting over the pulse point. It was beating frantically. I'm not afraid of the dark, Draco, she said, looking up into his eyes. I've lived in it for years. Maybe I'm tired of being the light all the time. Maybe I just want to be with someone who understands the shadows. Draco made a sound, a fractured inhale. He looked at her mouth, his resistance crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. The internal conflict raged behind his eyes, the desire to consume her, warring with the terror of corrupting her. Hermione, he breathed. It sounded like a prayer. He moved. His other hand came up hesitantly and cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, light as a feather, reverent. His skin was cool, but his touch burned. Hermione leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. The tension in the room shifted, thickened, transformed from hostile to something heavy and intoxicating. The air was charged with the static of unsaid things, finally finding a frequency. Draco lowered his head. His breath ghosted over her lips. He was close enough to kiss, close enough to ruin everything, close enough to save them both. If I start this, he whispered against her mouth, his voice rough with need. I won't be able to stop. I won't be able to let you go. Do you understand? I'm not asking you to let go, she whispered back. He hesitated, a second of agonizing restraint. Then he pulled back. It wasn't a rejection. It was a pause, a moment of clarity. He rested his forehead against hers again, just like in the greenhouse, but this time he didn't run. Not like this, he murmured, his thumb stroking her cheek. Not when we're both ghosts. I need to be real first. You feel real to me. I need to be sure, he said, pulling away gently, though his eyes lingered on her lips with a hunger that made her knees weak. I need to know that this isn't just trauma bonding, that it's not just two drowning people clinging to driftwood. He stepped back, breaking the contact. The loss of his warmth was immediate and aching. Go to bed, Granger, he said softly. There was no malice in it, only a weary tenderness. Before I lose the last shred of my honor and do something very unslytherin. Like what? Like falling in love with a Gryffindor. The words were spoken so quietly, Hermione almost missed them. They hung in the moonlight, fragile and impossible. Draco turned back to the piano. He didn't play. He just stood there, leaning against the black wood, watching her. Go, he repeated. Hermione backed out of the room. She felt dizzy, electrified, her skin humming where he had touched her. She had come looking for a fight, and she had found a surrender. As she walked back through the dark corridors, the silence of the castle felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the echo of his piano and the terrifying, wonderful promise of the words he had almost said. The seesaw had stopped moving. It was balanced precariously on a razor's edge, and for the first time, Hermione wasn't afraid of falling. She was ready to jump. The promise of the music room hung over the castle like a suspended charm, shimmering, fragile, and terrified of gravity. For 2 days, the air between Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy was not silence, but a held breath. They moved around each other with the careful choreography of satellites avoiding a collision. Glances across the great hall were no longer empty. They were heavy with the weight of the words he hadn't said. "I won't be able to let you go." The memory of his thumb on her cheek burned hotter than the fire in the Gryffindor common room. But reality, as it always did, demanded its due. It was a Hogsmeade weekend. The castle was buzzing with the frantic energy of students desperate to escape the stone walls for a few hours of sugar and butterbeer. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unshed snow, and the wind bit at exposed skin with invisible teeth. Hermione hadn't planned to go. The thought of jostling crowds and forced cheerfulness made her stomach turn. But the castle felt suffocating, and the look in Draco's eyes that morning, a shuttered, distant grey, had unsettled her. He was pulling back. She could feel the retraction, the slow rebuilding of the walls she had managed to scale. She found him not in the village, but on the outskirts, near the crooked silhouette of the shrieking shack. He was standing near the fence, the collar of his black coat turned up against the wind, staring at the dilapidated structure. He looked like a sketch drawn in charcoal against the white snow, stark, lonely, and beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. He wasn't alone. 3 wizards, older, rough-looking men who looked like they had spent too much time in the Hogshead, were circling him. Their body language was aggressive, wands loosely held but clearly visible. Hermione's heart slammed against her ribs. She quickened her pace, her boots crunching loudly on the frozen path, her hand instinctively gripping her wand inside her pocket. "Got a lot of nerve showing your face here, boy," one of the men sneered. The wind carried his voice, ragged and slurring. "After what your lot did to this village, to my shop." Draco didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, his face a mask of bored indifference. But Hermione knew him now. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he was leaning slightly back, bracing for a blow he wouldn't defend against. "I am merely walking," Draco said. His voice was cool, detached. "The path is public property." "Public property," the man spat. He stepped closer, invading Draco's personal space. "You think you belong in the public. You belong in Azkaban, rotting with your father." "Perhaps," Draco replied softly. But the Wizengamot disagreed. "If you have a complaint, file it with the ministry." "I've got a complaint right here." The man raised his wand. A spark of red light fizzed at the tip. Draco didn't draw his wand. He didn't even flinch. He just watched the man with dead eyes, accepting the threat as if it were weather, inevitable and impersonal. "Expelliarmus!" The shout tore from Hermione's throat before she made the conscious decision to speak. The red jet of light hit the man's wand, blasting it out of his hand into a snowbank. The 3 men spun around. Draco's head snapped up, his eyes widening in horror as he saw her. "Hermione!" he breathed, the name slipping out before he could stop it. "Get away from him," Hermione ordered, storming forward. She stood between Draco and the men, her wand raised, her hair whipping around her face like a lion's mane. "Walk away. Now." The man who had been disarmed scrambled to retrieve his wand, scowling. "Protecting him, are you? The Golden Girl and the Death Eater? That's a twist for the papers." I said, "Leave." Her voice was ice and steel. "Unless you want to explain to the Auras why you were attacking a student." The men grumbled, exchanging dark looks, but they knew better than to fight Hermione Granger. With a final sneer at Draco and a spit on the ground, they turned and trudged back toward the village. Silence descended on the path, broken only by the howling wind. Hermione turned to Draco. She expected gratitude, or perhaps relief. What she found was fury. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. His voice was low, trembling with suppressed anger. "They were going to curse you, Draco. You were just standing there." "I can handle myself." "You weren't handling it. You were letting it happen." "Because I deserve it," he shouted. The sound cracked through the cold air, raw and jagged. "Do you think that was the first time? Do you think I don't hear it every time I walk down a corridor? They're right, Granger. They lost businesses. They lost family. And here I am, walking around in my expensive coat, breathing the air they think I stole. That doesn't mean you let them attack you. It means I take my punishment," he hissed, stepping closer, looming over her. "It means I don't drag you into the mud with me. Do you have any idea what you just did? You defended me. In public. By tomorrow, everyone will know. They'll look at you, and they'll see me. I don't care what they see. I care." He grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard, desperate. "I care, Hermione. I can't be the reason you fall. I can't be the stain on your reputation. You are the war heroine. You are the future Minister for Magic. And I am the wreckage." "Stop calling yourself that," she whispered, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. "You are not wreckage to me." "Then you aren't looking closely enough." He pushed her away, not violently, but with a firm, rejecting force. He turned his back on her, walking toward the tree line of the forbidden forest, away from the path, away from the village. "Draco, wait!" She followed him. The snow was deeper here, soaking the hem of her robes, but she ignored the cold. She caught up to him as he reached the edge of the trees, grabbing his arm to spin him around. "You can't just walk away every time it gets hard." "It's not getting hard, Granger. It's getting impossible." He looked down at her, his grey eyes anguished. "The other night, in the music room, it was a fantasy, a delusion. This?" He gestured back toward the village. "This is reality. The world hates me, and it will hate you for being with me." "I have fought Voldemort," Hermione said fiercely, tears stinging her eyes. "Do you really think I'm afraid of a few gossips in Hogsmeade?" "It's not about fear. It's about corrosion. I will corrode you." He leaned back against the rough bark of a pine tree, his energy spent. He looked defeated. The wind ruffled his platinum hair, making him look impossibly young and impossibly old at the same time. "Why is it so hard for you to believe that someone could want you?" Hermione asked softly. "Just you. Not the name, not the past. Just the boy who plays the piano in the dark. The boy who brews potions to stop the nightmares." Draco closed his eyes. A muscle feathered in his jaw. "Because that boy died on the astronomy tower. And I don't know who is left." "I know who is left," she said. She stepped into his space, pressing her body against his to share warmth, to force him to acknowledge her presence. The person who saved me from the plant. The person who gave me his sleep potion. You are good, Draco. Buried deep, maybe, but it's there. He opened his eyes. The grey was stormy, swirling with conflict. He looked at her lips, then her eyes. You are so stubborn, he whispered, a thread of wonder woven into the misery. You look at a ruin, and you see a castle. I see a home, she corrected. The word hit him like a physical blow. His breath hitched. He raised a trembling hand to touch a snowflake caught in her eyelashes. I want to believe you, he confessed, his voice barely audible over the wind. Gods, Hermione, I want to believe you so badly it hurts. But trusting me, it's a mistake. I will let you down. It's what I do. I fail people. Then fail me, she challenged. Make a mistake. Be human. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for you. The cold wind whipped around them, but in the shelter of the trees, the heat between them was rising. The intellectual tension, the banter, the shared trauma, it was all culminating in this moment of raw, desperate honesty. Draco let out a sound that was half groan, half sob. The walls finally, truly crumbled. He reached out, burying his hands in her wild, snowy hair, and pulled her to him. If this burns you, he warned, his face inches from hers. Don't say I didn't tell you. Burn me, she whispered. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was the crash of two tectonic plates. It was cold lips and hot breath, the taste of winter and peppermint and desperation. It was a kiss that held 7 years of hatred, a year of war, and months of silent, aching longing. Draco kissed her like he was drowning, and she was oxygen. He kissed her like he wanted to memorize the shape of her soul. His hands gripped her tightly, possessing her, anchoring her, as if he was terrified that if he let go, she would vanish like smoke. Hermione melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. The cold of the snow faded, replaced by the fire that roared through her veins. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a collision of worlds. It was the breaking of the final prejudice. For a long, suspended moment, there was nothing but the sensation of him. The scratch of his coat, the softness of his lips, the frantic beat of his heart against hers. Then, Draco pulled back. He didn't let her go, but he broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. He was gasping for air, his eyes squeezed shut. I can't be good, he whispered, his voice broken. But I can be yours, if you'll have me. I'll have you, she promised. He opened his eyes. The grey was clear now, no longer clouded by walls. It was terrifyingly open. Then we have to hide, he said, the reality seeping back in. Not forever, but for now, until I can stand next to you without casting a shadow. We don't have to hide, she argued weakly, though she knew he was right. Yes, he insisted. He brushed his thumb over her swollen lips. I won't let them touch you, Hermione. Not the papers, not the critics, not the past. I need time to figure out how to be the man who deserves this. He kissed her again, softer this time, a seal on a pact. Let's go back, he murmured, before we freeze. They walked back to the castle, not touching, separated by a foot of snowy path. But the space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a secret, a terrifying, wonderful secret that warmed them better than any cloak. But as they entered the castle gates, Hermione caught a glimpse of a figure watching them from the shadows of the clock tower. A flash of a camera lens, a quills scratching on a notepad. She shivered, and this time it wasn't from the cold. The world wasn't done with them yet. The seesaw had tipped toward warmth, but the gravity of their reality was waiting to pull it back down. For 3 days, the castle became a landscape of secrets. The romance between Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy existed in the negative spaces of Hogwarts. In the brush of a hand against a sleeve in a crowded corridor, in the silent exchange of glances across the great hall, in the scribbled notes folded into origami birds that flew between their bags in the library. It was a breathless, fragile existence. It felt like holding a lit candle in a hurricane, shielding the flame with cupped hands, terrified that a single gust of reality would snuff it out. Hermione lived for the stolen moments. The way Draco would lean against a pillar in the shadows of the charms corridor, waiting for her patrol to pass, just to whisper a greeting that sounded like a prayer. The way his eyes, usually so guarded, would soften into liquid silver when no one else was looking. But the hurricane was coming. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried on the wings of a screech owl. The great hall was loud with the clatter of cutlery and the chatter of students. The enchanted ceiling mirrored a bleak, iron-grey sky, threatening snow. Hermione was buttering a piece of toast, feeling a phantom warmth on her lips, a memory of a kiss in an alcove the night before, when the owl dropped the Daily Prophet into the jug of pumpkin juice in the center of the table. The splash was minimal. The impact was nuclear. Hermione fished the soggy paper out, intending to dry it with a charm. But the bold, moving headline froze the spell on her tongue. The Heroine and the Death Eater. A forbidden affair or a dark seduction. Beneath the screaming text was a grainy, monochrome photograph. It had been taken from a distance, through the trees, but the subjects were unmistakable. Draco Malfoy, leaning against a pine tree, his face twisted in anguish. And Hermione Granger, stepping into his space, her hands on his chest. The picture moved. It showed the moment she pulled him down. It showed the kiss. The silence that swept through the great hall was faster than any spell. It started at the Gryffindor table and rippled outward, silencing the Ravenclaws, then the Hufflepuffs. Finally, it hit the Slytherin table. Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. The air in the hall suddenly felt thin, insufficient to fill her lungs. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her, confused, betrayed, scandalized. She didn't look at them. She looked across the hall. Draco was sitting at the edge of the Slytherin table. He was holding a copy of the paper. His knuckles were white, gripping the edges so hard the paper was tearing. He wasn't looking at the photo. He was staring at the table, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying blankness. The occlumency walls were up. The drawbridge was raised. The boy who had played the piano in the moonlight was gone, replaced by the marble statue she had hated for 7 years. "Hermione?" Ginny's voice was a whisper, laced with shock. Is that real?" Hermione stood up. Her legs felt like wood. The screeching of her bench against the stone floor echoed in the unnatural silence. Across the room, Draco stood up too. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He turned on his heel, his black robes billowing like smoke, and walked out of the hall. He moved with a rigid, aristocratic dignity, but Hermione knew the gait. It was a funeral march. "Hermione!" Ron called out. his face a mixture of purple rage and confusion. She ignored him. She ignored the whispers that were starting to hiss like steam escaping a pipe. She ran. She chased him through the corridors, but he was fast. He moved like a shadow, slipping through secret passages and shortcuts she didn't know he knew. She lost him near the viaduct, the trail going cold in the biting winter wind. She searched for hours. She checked the library, the dungeons, the greenhouse, the music room, all empty. The castle felt vast and hostile, the portraits whispering as she passed, the suits of armor seeming to turn their helmets to watch the traitor. It wasn't until dusk that she found him. He was on the astronomy tower. It was the highest point in the castle, open to the elements. The wind here was ferocious, tearing at her robes and stinging her eyes. Draco was standing at the railing, looking out over the black lake. The sun was setting, bleeding crimson and bruised purple across the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone floor. He wasn't wearing his cloak. He stood in just his shirt and trousers, freezing, punishing himself with the cold. "Draco," she called out. The wind stole the name, making it sound small. He didn't turn. "Don't come closer, Granger." His voice was unrecognizable. It was stripped of all emotion, hollowed out by a despair so deep it sounded physical. Hermione walked toward him anyway. She stopped 5 feet away, the distance feeling like a canyon. "We knew this might happen," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her teeth were chattering. "We knew people would talk." "Talk?" Draco let out a harsh, jagged laugh. He turned slowly to face her. His eyes were dead. The grey was flat, like slate. "Read the article, Hermione. They aren't talking. They are flaying you." He pulled a crumpled piece of parchment from his pocket. The article. "Is the war heroine under a curse?" he read, his voice dripping with acid. "Or has the insidious charm of the Malfoy fortune corrupted the brightest witch of her age? Sources say Malfoy has been preying on her vulnerability." He crumpled the paper and threw it over the railing. The wind caught it, carrying it away into the dark. "I am a predator to them," he said softly. "And you are the victim, even when you chose it. Even when you kissed me." "I don't care what Rita Skeeter writes," Hermione shouted, stepping closer. "I know the truth. You know the truth." "The truth doesn't matter," Draco roared. The sudden explosion of anger made her flinch. "Perception is reality, Granger. You, of all people, should know that. Look at what I've done to you. One photo, one moment of weakness, and I've turned you into a scandal. I've taken your victory and smeared it with my filth. You are not filth. I am to them." He slammed his hands against the iron railing. "And soon I will be to you. How long until the whispers get to you? How long until you lose a job promotion? How long until your friends stop speaking to you? You think you can handle it, but you can't. It's a rot. It eats everything." He looked at her, and for a second the mask cracked. She saw the sheer terror in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the public. He was afraid of destroying her. He loved her enough to break his own heart if it meant saving her future. "I'm ending it," he said. The words fell like guillotine blades. Hermione felt the air leave her lungs. "No, you don't get to decide that for me. I have to, because you are too stubborn to save yourself." He straightened up, pulling the icy demeanor around him like armor. "It was a mistake, a lapse. We were bored, we were traumatized, and we used each other. That's all it was. Liar, she whispered, tears spilling over, freezing on her cheeks. You played the piano for me. You held me while I cried. That wasn't boredom. It was a performance, he lied, but his voice cracked. I'm a Malfoy. We are good at lying. Look me in the eye and say you don't love me, she challenged. Do it. Draco looked at her. He looked at her tear-streaked face, her wild hair, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. He looked at the only person who had ever seen him, truly seen him, and not looked away. His hands clenched at his sides. He was vibrating with the effort to hold himself back. He started. He choked on the word. He couldn't say it. He couldn't say he didn't love her, because it was the only true thing he had left. Instead, he closed his eyes. I can't be with you, he whispered. I won't be the reason you fall. I'm not falling, Draco. I'm standing right here. You're standing on the edge of a precipice, he said, opening his eyes. They were wet now. And I'm the one pushing you off. He stepped away from the railing. He walked toward the stairwell, moving to pass her. He gave her a wide berth, as if he were contagious. Draco, please, she begged, reaching out to grab his sleeve. He jerked his arm away. The movement was violent, reflexive. Don't touch me, he hissed. Don't you get it? It's over. Go back to your friends. Go back to your golden life. Forget the monster in the dungeon. I can't forget you. Try, he commanded. He stopped at the top of the stairs. He didn't look back. His silhouette was framed against the darkening sky, sharp and lonely. If you come looking for me again, he said, his voice flat and cold, I will make you regret it. I will be everything they say I am. I will be cruel. I will be cold. Do not test me, Granger. He descended into the darkness of the stairwell. His footsteps echoed on the stone, fading away, leaving Hermione alone on the top of the tower. The wind howled around her, carrying the scent of snow and impending storm. She walked to the railing where he had stood. She looked down at the dark grounds, at the place where the paper had vanished. The seesaw had tipped. The warmth was gone. The trust was shattered. He had done exactly what he promised. He had pushed her away to protect her. But as Hermione gripped the freezing iron railing, feeling the bite of the metal against her palms, she didn't feel the resignation he wanted her to feel. She felt a burning, incandescent anger. He thought he could make the choice for her. He thought he could sacrifice his happiness to save her reputation. He thought he was being noble. He was wrong. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand. The movement was sharp, decisive. He had built a wall. Fine. She was the brightest witch of her age. She knew how to break down walls. She knew how to dismantle wards. And she knew that underneath the ice, he was burning just as hot as she was. This wasn't the end. This was the final test. Hermione turned and walked toward the stairs. She didn't run this time. She walked with purpose. The castle felt cold, yes. The whispers would be cruel, yes. But Draco Malfoy was alone in the dark, thinking he was doing the right thing. And Hermione Granger never left anyone behind, especially not the man she loved. The New Year's Eve ball was a desperate attempt by the faculty to inject joy into a castle that was still healing. The great hall had been transformed into a winter palace of silver frost and floating icicles that dripped luminescent sparks. The ceiling mimicked a midnight sky, so clear and star-studded it made the heart ache. For Hermione Granger, it was a battlefield. She stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand gripping the banister. She wasn't wearing her school robes. She wore dress robes of deep oxblood red, a colour of defiance, of Gryffindor fire, stark against the sea of silver and pale blue that filled the hall. The music swelled, a waltz, elegant and haunting. The whispers started the moment she took the first step down. They were a hissing tide, rising to meet her. The fallen heroine, the traitor, the scandal. Hermione held her head high. She didn't look at the crowd. Her eyes were locked on a single point in the shadows of the far corner, near the enchanted ice sculpture of a phoenix. Draco Malfoy was there. He looked like a prince of winter. His dress robes were black velvet, cut sharp to accentuate the line of his shoulders. His hair was silver white under the enchanted lights. He held a crystal tumbler of fire whiskey, but he wasn't drinking. He was staring at the ice sculpture with a look of profound boredom that Hermione now knew was a fortress wall. He hadn't looked up when she entered. He was determined to keep his promise. I will be cruel. I will be cold. Hermione reached the bottom of the stairs. The crowd parted for her, not out of respect, but out of a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. She was radioactive. She walked through the gap. She didn't rush. She moved with the steady, terrifying inevitability of a curse. As she got closer, she saw the tension in Draco's frame. He knew she was there. He could feel her. The seesaw was tilting violently, the magnetic pull between them dragging at his composure. His knuckles turned white around the glass. Hermione stopped 3 feet away from him. The circle of silence around them was absolute. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. You're drinking alone, she said. Her voice was calm, clear, carrying over the murmurs. Draco turned his head slowly. The movement was languid, mocking. He looked her up and down, his grey eyes flat and hard. He sneered, a perfect, practiced replica of the expression he had worn at 12 years old. And you are dressed like a target, Granger, he drawled. The voice was cold, razor sharp. Red, subtle, trying to distract from the headlines or confirm them. I'm not hiding, Draco. Clearly. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. You should be. You look ridiculous. Standing here, pretending you still belong, while everyone wonders how much darkness rubbed off on you. It was a cruel thing to say. It was meant to hurt. It was meant to make her turn and run, to save herself from the monster he was painting himself to be. But Hermione saw the tremor in the hand holding the glass. She saw the way his pupils were blown wide, devouring the sight of her in the red dress. Is that the best you can do? She asked softly, stepping closer. Draco's sneer faltered. I can do worse. I can leave. I can make a scene. I can tell them all that you were just a conquest, a bored experiment. Do it, she challenged. Tell them. Draco opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. He looked at her fierce, unwavering face, and the lie turned to ash. He couldn't do it. He could push her away, but he couldn't degrade what they had found in the quiet corners of the castle. Why are you doing this? He whispered, the mask cracking. Why won't you just let me save you? Because I don't need saving from you, Hermione said. I need saving from a life where I pretend to be perfect, where I pretend I don't feel this. She reached out. The crowd gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the air from the room. Hermione took the glass from his hand and set it on a passing tray. Then she took his hand. His skin was ice cold. Hers was burning. "Dance with me," she commanded. "Hermione," he pleaded, his voice a low agony. "Look around. They are watching. If I touch you now, there is no going back. You will be branded. You will be Mrs. Malfoy's disappointment and the Ministry's headache." "I have been a disappointment to someone my whole life," she said. "I'm done living for the audience." She squeezed his hand. "The music is ending, Draco. The year is ending. Make a choice. Be a coward or be mine." The ultimatum hung in the air. Draco looked at the crowd, the faces of judgment, of hatred, of the past. Then he looked at Hermione. She was vibrant, alive, a splash of blood-red reality in a world of grey ghosts. She was looking at him not with pity, but with expectation. She believed he was brave. And because she believed it, it became true. Draco let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the astronomy tower. The ice in his eyes melted, replaced by a fire that matched hers. "You are going to be the death of me, Granger," he murmured. "I know." He moved. He didn't just take her hand. He claimed it. He pulled her out of the shadows, past the ice phoenix, and onto the center of the dance floor. The whispers exploded into open shock, but Draco didn't care. He slid his arm around her waist, his grip firm, possessive. He pulled her flush against him, destroying the space between them. The music shifted. A new waltz began, slow, deep, resonant. They moved together. It wasn't a polite ballroom dance. It was a conversation. It was the same rhythm they had found over the cauldron, the same syncopation as the duel in the library. He led her with a fluid, aristocratic grace, but she met him step for step, pushing back, turning the dance into a partnership of equals. "They're staring," Draco whispered against her hair. He sounded almost giddy, drunk on the adrenaline of the fall. "Let them stare," Hermione replied, looking up at him. "Let them take pictures. Let them write their articles. My mother will have a stroke. I'll send her flowers." Draco laughed. It was a genuine sound, rich and startled, bubbling up from his chest. It transformed his face, stripping away the years of war and guilt, leaving him breathless and young. "I missed you," he confessed, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. Gods, the last 3 days. It was like being back in the manor. It was suffocating. "I missed you too," she said. "The library was too quiet." "I almost broke my promise," he admitted, spinning her under the floating candles. "I almost came to your room. I had the invisibility cloak in my hand." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid that if I saw you, I wouldn't be able to leave again." Hermione stopped moving. They were in the center of the floor, surrounded by the swirling colors of the other dancers, but they were motionless. "Then don't leave," she said. Draco looked down at her. The conflict was gone. The guilt was there, perhaps. It would always be there, a scar on the skin, but it was no longer the driver. "I can't promise it will be easy," he said seriously. "I come with baggage, Hermione. Heavy baggage. Dark marks and dark memories." "I have strong arms," she smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "And I'm excellent at packing charms." Draco smiled, a soft, crooked thing that belonged only to her. "I love you," he said. The words were spoken quietly, lost to the music for everyone else, but for Hermione, they rang louder than a bell. He hadn't said it on the tower. He said it here, in the light, in the center of the world that wanted to tear them apart. "I love you too," she whispered back. The clock tower began to chime. Midnight, the new year. Draco didn't wait for the countdown. He didn't wait for the cheers. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a hidden kiss in a dark corridor. It wasn't a desperate kiss in a storm. It was a public declaration. It was deliberate, slow, and tender. It was a seal on a contract that said, "We are here. We are together. Deal with it." The flash of cameras went off like fireworks, blinding white light popping in the periphery. The crowd murmured and gasped. Draco broke the kiss, but didn't let her go. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes against the flashing lights. "Happy New Year, Granger," he murmured. "Happy New Year, Malfoy." "We should go," he said, opening one eye to glare at a Ravenclaw who was pointing at them. "Before I hex someone and ruin your red dress." "My room?" she suggested. "I believe the wards have been updated to account for stationary attacks." Draco smirked. "I'm sure I can find a workaround." They turned and walked out of the great hall together, hand in hand. Draco held his head high, his face composed, the Malfoy mask back in place. But this time, it was armor for two. He cut a path through the crowd for her, shielding her from the jostling bodies. As they reached the doors, Hermione glanced back. The hall was a blur of silver and light, a beautiful, frozen moment in time. But it was the past. She looked forward, at the back of the boy, the man in the black velvet coat, the man who had learned to play the piano in the dark, the man who had let himself be caught in a trap of paper birds just to be near her. They stepped out into the corridor. The heavy oak doors boomed shut behind them, muffling the music and the whispers. The silence of the castle enveloped them. But it wasn't the heavy, screaming silence of the past months. It was a blank page. "Where to?" Draco asked, his voice echoing in the empty stone hallway. He squeezed her hand, an anchor in the quiet. Hermione squeezed back. She felt the phantom brush of magic, the sensation of being watched. But this time she knew exactly who was watching, and she welcomed it. "Anywhere," she said, "as long as it's with you." Draco pulled her close, wrapping the invisibility cloak, which he had indeed had in his pocket all along, around both of them. "Then let's disappear," he whispered against her ear. The world shimmered and vanished. The corridor appeared empty. But if one listened closely, past the wind howling against the windows, they might have heard the soft sound of laughter and the fading footsteps of two people walking into the future, unseen, but finally completely seen by each other.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for listening to this story. You know, writing about Draco and Hermione is always an adventure. They are so different. One is fire, one is ice. But in this story, I wanted to show that they are actually the same. They are both lonely. They are both trying to heal. My favorite part was the paper birds. It was funny, but also very sweet. It shows that even Draco Malfoy can be surprised. I think we all have a mask sometimes. We hide who we really are. But this story is about taking that mask off. It is about finding someone who sees the real you and stays. I hope this story made you smile. I hope it made you feel something warm. Remember, even in the dark castle, there is always a little bit of light. Thank you for being here with me. See you in the next story.